Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Imagine a boy born to a conman father who disappeared for months at a time, leaving the family in uncertainty and shame, yet who would grow up to become the richest man in the world. Picture a teenager who started as an assistant bookkeeper, earning $4.50 a week, yet who would control 90% of an entire industry before he turned 40. Consider a man universally despised as a ruthless monopolist, a robber baron who crushed competitors without mercy, yet who gave away more than $500 million to educational and scientific causes, transforming the landscape of American philanthropy. This is the story of John Davison Rockefeller. His life spans the entire transformation of America from a rural, agricultural nation to an industrial powerhouse. He witnessed the Civil War, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the rise of electricity, the invention of the automobile, the Great Depression, and the approach of a Second World War. He was born in a farmhouse lit by candles and died in a mansion with air conditioning. He lived 97 years and saw everything change, and more than perhaps any other single person, he was the architect of that change. He showed America what capitalism could build, for better and for worse. He created the first great business trust, the template for every corporate empire that followed. He also created the model of systematic scientific philanthropy that changed how the wealthy gave away their money. The paradoxes of his life are almost too numerous to count. The son of a bigamist snake oil salesman, became the epitome of Baptist rectitude. A man who rarely spoke in shaped public opinion for generations. Someone who preached the virtues of competition spent his career eliminating it. A businessman who made his fortune from oil-funded research that would eventually help move the world beyond oil. A man hated in his prime became beloved in his old age. How did this happen? How did a boy from a broken family in rural New York become John D. Rockefeller? That is the question we will answer tonight. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps support this work and means a great deal. I'm also curious to know where in the world you're listening tonight. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're joining us from and what time it is where you are. Now, settle in. Let the noise of the world fade away. We're about to travel back to 1839, to a world without electric lights, without telephones, without automobiles, to a nation of farms and small towns, to a time when oil was something you dug out of the ground in Pennsylvania and had no idea what to do with. Tonight, we will follow John D. Rockefeller from a modest farmhouse in upstate New York, through the streets of Cleveland to the boardrooms where empires were built and destroyed, and finally to the philanthropic foundations that still shape our world today. It is a story of ambition and ruthlessness, of discipline and faith, of a man who changed everything. But to understand how John Davison Rockefeller came to be, we must first understand the world into which he was born, and more importantly, we must understand his parents. Two people so different from each other that their marriage seemed like an act of cosmic irony. Richford, New York in 1839 was barely a village, more an idea than a place. It sat in the southern tier of New York State in Tioga County, in a landscape of rolling hills and thick forests, far from any city of consequence. The Erie Canal, which had opened in 1825, had transformed upstate New York, bringing commerce and prosperity to towns along its route. But Richford was nowhere near the canal. It was deep in the countryside, a place where families farmed rocky soil and struggled to make ends meet, where the nearest market town required a full day's journey by wagon, where winters were long and brutal and summers were brief and too often dry. This was the American frontier in miniature, a place where European immigrants and their descendants tried to carve out new lives from an unforgiving landscape. The towns were small, usually built around a church and a general store. The houses were simple wooden structures, rarely more than one story, heated by fireplaces that struggled against the winter cold. Most families grew their own food, raised their own animals, made their own clothes. Money was scarce. Barter was common. A man's worth was measured not in dollars but in the straightness of his furrows, the soundness of his barn, the honesty of his handshake. Into this world of plain virtues and hard work the Rockefeller family did not quite fit. The Rockefellers were not natives of this area. They had German origins. Their name, originally Rockefeller or Roggenfelder, changed over generations and ocean crossings until it became the solidly English-sounding Rockefeller. John's grandfather, Godfrey Lewis Rockefeller, had been a farmer of modest success, but his father, William Avery Rockefeller, had no interest in farming or in any honest trade that required regular labour. William Avery Rockefeller was born in November 1810, the third of 10 children. Tall and strong, with a commanding presence and a gift for storytelling, he might have become a successful farmer or tradesman if he'd possessed even a modicum of respect for conventional morality. But William, who had come to be known as Devil Bill, had other ideas about how to make his way in the world. From his earliest days, he expended considerable energy on tricks and schemes to avoid plain hard work. By his early 20s, William was travelling through New York and Pennsylvania as a peddler, selling trinkets and patent medicines, elixirs he claimed could cure everything from consumption to cancer. He was a confidence man in the truest sense, a man who inspired confidence in order to exploit it. Sometimes he carried a slate reading "I am deaf and dumb," so he could feign disability while eavesdropping on conversations, gathering information he would later use to fleece the soft-hearted. He was an excellent hunter, fisherman, and fiddle player. He was charming when he needed to be, terrifying when that served him better, and he had no conscience whatsoever about separating fools from their money. In the mid-1830s, Devil Bill was working the towns around Moravia, New York, when he met two women who would shape the rest of his duplicitous life. The first was Nancy Brown, a beautiful but penniless local girl. The second was Eliza Davison, a red-haired woman whose father was a prosperous farmer. William courted both. He took Nancy as a lover. He married Eliza for her $500 dowry. Eliza Davison was everything William was not. Where he was unpredictable, she was steady. Where he was charming and superficial, she was quiet and deep. Where he scorned religion, she found in it the very meaning of existence. She was a devout Baptist, a woman of absolute moral rectitude, taught from childhood in the virtues of discipline, thrift, hard work, and godliness. Why she married William Avery Rockefeller is one of the mysteries that perhaps not even she could have explained. The story goes that when Eliza first encountered William, he was posing as a deaf-mute peddler. She was so charmed by the silent stranger that she declared to a friend, "I'd marry that man if he were not deaf and dumb." When it turned out he was faking his disability as part of a scheme, a decent woman might have seen the deception as a warning. But Eliza, perhaps in the only rebellion of her otherwise controlled life, overlooked the fraud and agreed to marry him. Her father opposed the match. He knew something of William's character, or lack thereof. But Eliza persisted, and on February 18th, 1837, she became Mrs. William Rockefeller. If she imagined she could reform him, she was mistaken. If she thought marriage would settle him, she was disappointed. Within weeks of the wedding, William hired Nancy Brown as the family's housekeeper, installing his mistress under the same roof as his wife. There, in a small house in Richford, this strange household took shape. Eliza, the wife, enduring in righteous silence. Nancy, the mistress, bearing William 2 daughters, and William himself, a man who treated his home as merely one stop on a circuit of schemes and scams. The house they lived in was modest even by the standards of rural New York. It was a simple frame structure, probably no more than 3 rooms, sitting on land that William had acquired through one deal or another. There was no running water, no indoor plumbing. Heat came from a fireplace and a wood stove. The floors were bare wood. The windows were small. In winter, frost formed on the inside of the glass. It was into this house, into this strange and troubled family, on the 8th of July, 1839, that John Davison Rockefeller was born. He was the second child of William and Eliza, coming after his sister Lucy. He would be followed by William Jr., Mary, and the twins Franklin and Francis. In all, Eliza would bear 6 children who survived to adulthood, and she would raise them largely alone, because William was almost never there. The name John was common enough, a good Christian name. Davison was Eliza's maiden name, a way of honouring her family, her father who had warned her against this marriage. It was as if she was claiming the boy for her side of the family from the very beginning. From his earliest days, young John lived in a household defined by absence and discipline. His father would disappear for weeks or months at a time, travelling through the countryside as Dr. William Livingston, a name he had assumed along with a false persona. He sold his bottles of coloured water and alcohol to desperate people, claimed he could cure cancer for $25 a treatment, made enough money to fill his pockets with cash, and then vanished again. When he returned home, he arrived with bags of coins and bills, which he would stack on the table and count in front of his children, teaching them the value of money by showing them more of it than their neighbours had ever seen. But he taught them other lessons too, lessons about trust and deception. One story that would be told for generations involved William placing young John on a high chair and encouraging him to jump into his father's waiting arms. The boy would leap, trusting, and William would catch him. Then, without warning, William would step back and let the boy crash to the floor. "Remember," he would tell his crying son, "never trust anyone completely, not even me." This was the education of the boy who would become the world's richest man. Lessons in the unreliability of others, lessons in the necessity of self-reliance. Eliza provided the counter-education. Where William taught cunning, Eliza taught rectitude. Where William showed that rules were made to be broken, Eliza demonstrated that rules were sacred. She raised her children in the Baptist faith, taking them to church every Sunday despite William's frequent absence. She taught them to work, to save, and most importantly to give. From the Baptist tradition came the practice of tithing, giving 10% of one's income to the church. Even when the family had little, Eliza insisted on this discipline, and young John, serious and observant, absorbed the lesson. By the time John was 7 or 8, he was already different from other boys his age. Where they were rambunctious, he was quiet. Where they were spontaneous, he was calculating. He kept a small notebook where he recorded every penny he earned and every penny he spent. He raised turkeys for his mother and sold them for profit. He did small jobs for neighbours, weeding gardens, running errands. By the age of 12, he had saved over $50, an extraordinary sum for a child. And then, urged by his mother, he lent that $50 to a local farmer at 7% interest payable in 1 year. When the farmer paid him back the following year with $3.50 in interest, young John was transfixed. The impression was gaining ground with him, he later said, that it was a good thing to let money work for you. Money, he learned, could make more money while you slept. This was a revelation that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his long life. But the family's life in Richford could not last. William's schemes were catching up with him. In 1849, he was indicted for rape in Auburn, New York, a crime allegedly committed at gunpoint. He was never prosecuted, never tried, but the shadow of the accusation followed him. There were rumours too of horse theft, of involvement in a gang that stole livestock and sold it in distant markets. Whether these rumours were true or false, they made Richford uncomfortable for the Rockefellers. So the family moved, as they would move again and again throughout John's childhood. First to Moravia, New York, then to Owago. Each move took them to a new town where William's reputation had not yet arrived, where he could start fresh with a new set of marks and schemes. For young John and his siblings, this meant new schools, new neighbours, new churches. It meant instability, impermanence. It meant learning that home was not a place but a collection of people, and that even that collection was unreliable since father was always leaving. In 1853, when John was 14, the family made their most significant move yet. They left New York State entirely and travelled west to Ohio, settling first in Strongsville, a small town outside Cleveland, then in Cleveland itself. This move would prove to be the hinge on which John's entire future would turn. Cleveland in 1853 was a city on the rise, a place crackling with energy and possibility. It sat on the shore of Lake Erie, connected to the east by canal, and to the west by the vast waterways of the Great Lakes. The Ohio and Erie Canal, completed in 1832, had made Cleveland a major transshipment point for goods moving between the eastern seaboard and the expanding frontier. By the time the Rockefellers arrived, the city had a population of about 17,000, making it one of the largest cities John had ever seen. The streets were mud in spring and dust in summer, crowded with wagons hauling grain, lumber, coal, and all the raw materials of a growing nation. There were warehouses along the canal and the Cuyahoga River, commission houses where merchants bought and sold commodities, banks where money changed hands, churches where the pious sought redemption, and saloons where the less pious sought oblivion. The air smelled of industry, smoke from foundries and mills, the smell of a nation transforming itself from agricultural to industrial. For a boy from rural New York, this was overwhelming and exhilarating. The sheer scale of commerce, the volume of money changing hands, the sense that fortunes were being made every day in these muddy streets, all of this ignited something in John's disciplined, calculating mind. This was where he wanted to be. This was where he could make something of himself. But first, there was school. John was enrolled in Central High School in Cleveland, boarding in the city during the week while his family remained in Strongsville. It was a sacrifice for the family, the cost of room and board, but Eliza was determined that her children would have education, the education she and William had never received. John proved to be a good student, not brilliant but steady, methodical, never forgetting anything he learned. He was particularly strong in mathematics, which came to him naturally and weak in nothing except perhaps sociability. He made few friends. He didn't seek attention. He was the boy in the back of the room who always knew the answer but rarely volunteered it. After 3 years at Central High School, John did not graduate. His education ended, not because he had failed, but because there was no money to continue, and because he had decided that formal schooling had taught him what it could. What he needed now was not more lessons in Latin or rhetoric, but practical training in business. So in the summer of 1855, at the age of 16, he enrolled in a 3-month commercial course at Folsom's Commercial College, a business school that promised to teach bookkeeping, penmanship, commercial law, and banking. For 10 weeks, from July to September, John immersed himself in the mechanics of business. He learned double-entry bookkeeping, the system by which every transaction is recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, creating a self-checking mechanism that reveals errors and prevents fraud. He learned to write a clear commercial hand, the careful script used in ledgers and contracts. He learned the basics of negotiable instruments, promissory notes, bills of exchange. He learned how banks operated, how interest was calculated, how credit was extended and collected. He was a diligent student, perhaps the most diligent Folsoms had ever seen, because he understood that this was not theoretical knowledge, but the practical foundation of wealth. On September 26, 1855, John completed his studies. That same day he set out to find a job. He was 16 years old, tall and thin, already balding despite his youth, wearing a dark suit he could barely afford and a serious expression that made him look older than his years. He walked the streets of Cleveland, going from one commission house to another, from one business to another, asking if they needed a bookkeeper or clerk. He was turned away again and again, too young, too inexperienced. No openings at present. Try again next month. But John was nothing if not persistent. On the afternoon of that first day of job hunting, he walked into the office of Hewitt and Tuttle, a commission merchant firm dealing in grain, hay, meats, and miscellaneous merchandise. He asked to see one of the partners. An older gentleman, Isaac Hewitt, listened to his brief introduction. "We'll give you a chance," Hewitt said. It was one sentence spoken without ceremony, but it changed everything. John D. Rockefeller had entered the business world. He would commemorate this day for the rest of his life, celebrating his personal job day every September 26th, with the same reverence most people reserve for their birthdays. Because that day, that chance, was when his real life began. His starting salary was $4.50 a week. It was not much, barely enough to pay for room and board, but it was a beginning, and John Rockefeller understood beginnings. He understood that every fortune started with small steps, that the man who could not be trusted with $4.50 would never be trusted with 4,000 or 40,000 or 400,000. So he threw himself into the work with the same methodical intensity he had brought to everything else in his young life. As an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt and Tuttle, John's duties were at first mundane. He copied invoices, updated ledgers, calculated sums, checked figures. But he did these tasks with such accuracy and such speed that within months he was given more responsibility. He began to handle correspondence, to deal with shippers and buyers, to negotiate freight rates. The business of Hewitt and Tuttle was complex, involving the coordination of multiple modes of transportation, railroad, canal, and lake boats, to move commodities from producers to markets. A single shipment of grain might travel by wagon to a canal, landing by canal boat to Cleveland, by lake steamer to Buffalo, and by railroad from there to New York City. Each leg of the journey had its own costs, its own scheduling, its own risks. John proved to have a natural genius for this kind of logistics. He could see the whole system in his mind, could calculate the most efficient routes, could negotiate rates with shippers who had been in the business longer than he had been alive. He was cautious, never taking unnecessary risks, but when he was certain of a course of action, he moved boldly. This combination of caution and decisiveness, of thorough analysis followed by swift execution, would characterize his business methods for the rest of his career. The partners noticed. Within a year, John was effectively running much of the firm's day-to-day operations. He was not yet 20 years old. His salary had increased, but not by much. He was making $500 a year, decent pay for a young clerk, but nowhere near what he knew he was worth to the firm. He said nothing, did nothing to indicate his dissatisfaction. He simply continued to work, to learn, to prove his value, and he continued to practice the disciplines his mother had taught him. He attended the Erie Street Baptist Church every Sunday, the same church the family had joined when they first arrived in Cleveland. He tithed 10% of his income to the church, even when that meant he had barely enough left to live on. He kept meticulous records of every penny. his account book showing not just business transactions but personal expenditures, gifts to charity, loans to family members. Everything was written down, everything was accounted for, nothing was left to chance or forgotten. During these years, John was also watching his father continue his deceptions. William had not reformed with age. If anything, he had become more brazen. In 1855, the same year John started at Hewitt & Tuttle, William Avery Rockefeller still, legally married to Eliza, travelled to Canada and married a 17-year-old girl named Margaret Allen, introducing himself as Dr. William Livingston. He was now a bigamist, maintaining 2 families, 2 identities, 2 lives. He would continue this double existence for the rest of his long life, visiting Eliza and the children occasionally, bringing money when he came, then disappearing for months to live with Margaret under an assumed name. John knew something of this, though perhaps not all of it. He knew his father was unreliable, dishonest, shameful. He knew that the man who had taught him never to trust anyone had proven himself untrustworthy. And perhaps this knowledge hardened something in John's character, strengthened his resolve to be different, to be the opposite of his father in every way that mattered. Where William was improvident, John would be careful. Where William was dishonest, John would be scrupulous in his business dealings, or at least he would tell himself he was. Where William abandoned his family, John would be a provider, a rock, a man his mother could be proud of. By 1858, John had been with Hewitt & Tuttle for 3 years. He was 19 years old, and he had learned everything the firm could teach him. He knew the commission business inside and out, knew how to buy and sell commodities, knew how to arrange transportation, knew how to extend credit and collect debts. But he was still an employee, still making a salary while the partners made the real profits. It was time, he decided, to go into business for himself. On March 1st, 1859, several months before his 20th birthday, John D. Rockefeller formed a partnership with Morris B. Clark, a neighbour and fellow church member. The partnership was called Clark and Rockefeller, and it was a commission merchant business just like Hewitt & Tuttle, dealing in grain, hay, and other farm products. Clark put up $2,000 in capital. John had saved $800 from his years of work. He needed $1,200 more. He went to his father. This was a delicate negotiation. John despised asking William for anything, but he needed the money, and his father had money. William, always looking for an opportunity to profit, agreed to lend his son the $1,200 at 10% interest, a usurious rate by any standard, higher than what banks would charge. But John took the loan, knowing he could pay it back, knowing that his father was teaching him one last lesson about the cost of dependence. With that loan, Clark and Rockefeller opened for business in the spring of 1859, just weeks before John turned 20. The timing was fortuitous. The nation was on the brink of war, though no one knew it yet, and war would bring opportunities in the commodities trade. But even before the war, the partnership prospered. John brought to it all the skills and connections he had developed at Hewitt & Tuttle, plus his own relentless drive to succeed. He worked from dawn until late at night, negotiating, calculating, keeping the books, making sure every transaction was profitable. That same year, 1859, something else happened that would prove even more important than John's new business venture. In August, in Titusville, Pennsylvania, a former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake successfully drilled the first commercial oil well in America. Drake's well, using a steam engine to power a drill that went down 69 feet into the earth, struck oil at a rate of about 25 barrels per day. It was, at the time, a curiosity more than anything else. No one quite knew what to do with petroleum. You could refine it into kerosene for lamps, a competitor to whale oil, but the process was expensive and dangerous, and the product was not much better than what already existed. Still, entrepreneurs began to flock to western Pennsylvania, buying up land, drilling wells, hoping to strike it rich. The Pennsylvania oil rush began, and with it the first glimmerings of an industry that would transform the world. But in 1859, John D. Rockefeller, busy with his commission business in Cleveland, paid little attention to oil. He had other concerns. The concerns intensified in 1861 when the Civil War began. The war was a catastrophe for the nation, but it was a windfall for commodity traders. Suddenly the government needed vast quantities of grain to feed the army, meat to sustain the soldiers, hay to feed the horses. Prices soared, demand seemed limitless. Clark and Rockefeller, positioned in Cleveland with access to Western agricultural products and Eastern markets, made money hand over fist. John was methodical even in the midst of abundance. While other traders got swept up in the frenzy, buying and selling recklessly, gambling on ever-rising prices, John remained cautious. He calculated risks carefully, never overextending, always keeping enough cash on hand to weather any sudden reversals. This conservatism served him well when markets did reverse, when other traders went bankrupt. Clark and Rockefeller survived every downturn and emerged stronger. By 1863, the partnership had accumulated significant capital, more money than two young men from modest backgrounds could have imagined a few years earlier. And that year, John made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He decided to enter the oil refining business. The decision was driven by opportunity and calculation. The oil fields in Pennsylvania were producing more and more crude oil, but the real money, John understood, was not in pumping oil from the ground. The real money was in refining it, turning crude petroleum into useful products like kerosene. Refineries were springing up all over, in Pennsylvania, in New York and Cleveland. Cleveland had advantages. It was connected by railroad to the oil regions, by water to eastern markets. It had skilled workers, access to capital, and entrepreneurs willing to take risks. John and Morris Clark partnered with a man named Samuel Andrews, a skilled chemist who understood the refining process. Together they built a refinery on Kingsbury Run in Cleveland, investing $4,000 in the venture. It was a modest operation at first, but it was well run, efficient, producing a high-quality kerosene that burned cleanly with minimal smoke. John applied to refining the same principles he had brought to the commission business: control costs, maximize efficiency, reinvest profits, grow carefully but relentlessly. For 2 years, from 1863 to 1865, John operated both businesses, the commission merchant trade with Clark and the oil refining operation. It was exhausting, but he was young and driven. Then, in 1865, tensions arose between John and Morris Clark. Clark wanted to focus on the commission business, which was safe and profitable. John wanted to focus on oil, which was risky but potentially far more lucrative. They argued. They could not agree. Finally, they decided to dissolve the partnership, with the various assets to be auctioned off between them. At the auction, held in February 1865, John and Morris Clark bid against each other for control of the oil refinery. The bidding went back and forth: $500, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000. Clark bid $50,000. John bid $55,000. Clark bid $60,000. John bid $65,000. Clark bid $70,000. John, without hesitation, bid $72,000 and $500, every penny he could raise or borrow. Clark looked at him and said, "The business is yours." It was the most money John had ever spent, a staggering sum for a young man not yet 26 years old. But he had calculated that it was worth it. The refinery was profitable now and would only become more profitable as the oil industry grew. and he was right. With sole control of the refinery, John moved decisively. He bought out minor partners, brought in new investors who shared his vision, and most importantly, he invited Henry Flagler to join him as a partner. Flagler was a few years older than John, the husband of John's cousin, a man with business experience and access to capital. Together, Rockefeller and Flagler would prove to be one of the most formidable business partnerships in American history. They complemented each other perfectly. John was the strategic mind, the planner, the man who thought 10 moves ahead. Flagler was the deal maker, the negotiator, the man who could charm or intimidate as the situation required. Together they set out to build not just a successful refinery, but the largest oil refining operation in the world. But before we follow John deeper into the oil business, we must pause to consider his personal life. Because in 1864, amid all his business ventures, he had done something uncharacteristic. He had fallen in love. Her name was Laura Celestia Spellman, though she was called Setty. She was John's age, born in September 1839, the daughter of a prosperous merchant and politician named Harvey Buell Spellman. The Spellmans were active in the abolitionist movement, supporters of the Underground Railroad, people of strong moral convictions. Setty had been educated at what would become Spellman College, a school for women, and she was intelligent, cultured, and deeply religious. John met her at the Erie Street Baptist Church, the same church where he practiced his faith every Sunday. They courted for several years, a courtship conducted with all the propriety expected of two devout Baptists. There were Sunday dinners, walks after church, carefully supervised visits. They spoke of faith, of duty, of their hopes for the future. They discovered they shared the same values, the same work ethic, the same commitment to living lives of purpose and principle. On September 8th, 1864, they were married in Cleveland. The wedding was simple, befitting their modest circumstances at the time. John was 25. Setty had just turned 25. They moved into a modest home on Cheshire Street in Cleveland, a small frame house that was nevertheless a significant step up from the cramped quarters where John had grown up. Setty would manage the household with the same efficiency John brought to business. She kept the accounts, managed the servants when they could afford servants, raised the children that would come, and children did come. In March 1866, their first daughter Bessie was born. She was followed by Alice in 1869, though Alice would die in infancy, a loss that devastated both John and Setty. Then came Alta in 1871, Edith in 1872, and finally in January 1874, their long-awaited son, John D. Rockefeller Jr. John was a devoted father in his own austere way. He believed in discipline, in teaching children to work and save and give. He paid them for chores, kept account books of their earnings and expenditures, expected them to tithe just as he did. But he was not a warm man, not demonstrative. His affection showed itself in providing, in making sure his children wanted for nothing, in creating opportunities for them that he had never had. Setty provided the warmth, the emotional support, the daily comfort that children need. But even as John was building his family, his attention was primarily on building his business. And in the late 1860s, that business was about to explode in size and ambition in ways that would make him the most powerful man in American industry and one of the most hated men in America. By 1867, the firm of Rockefeller and Flagler was operating the largest oil refinery in Cleveland. They had achieved this through relentless focus on efficiency. While other refineries wasted the byproducts of refining, Rockefeller and Flagler found uses for everything. They made their own barrels to ship kerosene, saving money on cooperage. They owned their own warehouses, their own wagons, even their own horses. Every aspect of the business was brought in-house. Every cost was scrutinized and minimized. but controlling costs was only part of the strategy. The real key to dominance in the oil business, John realised, was controlling transportation. In the 1860s and 70s, the only practical way to ship oil and refined products from the oil regions to market was by railroad, and there were only a few major railroads serving the region. The Erie, the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania Railroad all competed viciously for the oil traffic, and in that competition, John saw opportunity. He approached the railroads with a proposition. Rockefeller and Flagler would guarantee large, steady shipments, 60 carloads a day or more, if the railroad would give them substantial rebates, discounts off the published shipping rates. The railroads, desperate for reliable high-volume customers, agreed. The exact details of these agreements were kept secret, but the effect was that Rockefeller could ship oil much more cheaply than his competitors. An oil refiner paying full freight rates might pay $2 per barrel to ship kerosene to New York. Rockefeller was paying perhaps 50 cents. This gave him an enormous advantage. He could sell kerosene for less than his competitors and still make a profit. Or he could sell it for the same price and make a much larger profit, which he could then reinvest in expanding his operations. Either way, his competitors could not match him. Smaller refiners protested. They complained that the rebates were unfair, that they amounted to preferential treatment that violated the common carrier obligations of the railroads. But the railroads were private companies, free to negotiate whatever rates they chose, and they chose to favour their largest customers. It was, the railroad executive said, simple business sense. Why should they charge the same rate to a refiner shipping 1 carload a week and a refiner shipping 60 carloads a day? The large shipper deserved a volume discount. John agreed wholeheartedly. He saw nothing wrong with using his size and leverage to get better terms. This, he believed, was how business worked. The strong survived. The weak did not. It was that simple. On January 10th, 1870, Rockefeller took the next step in his strategy. He dissolved the partnership with Flagler and several other investors and incorporated as a new entity the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. The name was deliberate. Standard Oil would set the standard for quality and service in the oil industry, would be the benchmark against which all others were measured. The company was capitalized at $1 million, an enormous sum for the time. John held the largest share, about 26%, making him the president and the single most powerful voice in the company's operations. From the moment of its incorporation, Standard Oil began to grow at a pace that stunned even those who worked there. John's strategy was brutally simple. He would buy out his competitors, consolidating the refining business under his control. He would do this systematically, methodically, one refinery at a time, until he controlled not just Cleveland but the entire industry. In 1872, John launched what would later be called the Cleveland Massacre, though no blood was shed and no laws were broken, at least not obviously. Over a period of just 3 months, he approached every significant oil refiner in Cleveland and made them an offer. He would buy their refineries, either for cash or, preferably for shares in Standard Oil. He would explain to them that the oil business was chaotic, inefficient, plagued by overproduction and price instability. There were too many refiners, too much capacity. The industry needed consolidation. By joining Standard Oil, they would be part of a stable, profitable enterprise, freed from the constant worry of competition. Some refiners accepted the offer eagerly. They were tired of the struggle, tired of the uncertainty. They took their payment in Standard Oil stock and became rich men, richer than they had ever dreamed, because Standard Oil stock would prove to be one of the most valuable investments in American history. Others resisted. They did not want to sell. They believed in independence, in competition, in their own ability to survive. To these refiners, John took a different approach. He would point out that he controlled the transportation, the railroads. He could ship oil for a fraction of what they paid. He could undercut their prices, drive them into bankruptcy. They could sell now on reasonable terms, or they could fight and lose everything. It was not precisely a threat. It was simply a statement of fact. And the fact was undeniable. Within 3 months, Standard Oil had acquired 22 of Cleveland's 25 refineries. Almost overnight, the company controlled not just the largest refinery, but most of the refining capacity in the region. Rockefeller had won Cleveland, but Cleveland was only the beginning. Over the next decade, Standard Oil would expand across Pennsylvania, across New York, across the entire eastern United States, buying refineries, building pipelines, acquiring transportation networks, until by 1880, the company controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining in America. 90%. It was a level of dominance rarely if ever seen in any industry, a monopoly in everything but name. The methods John used to achieve this dominance would be debated for generations. Were they fair? Were they legal? Or were they the ruthless tactics of a robber baron who crushed all competition and created a monopoly that harmed consumers and enriched himself at the expense of everyone else? John's defenders would point out that while Standard Oil dominated the industry, it also brought dramatic improvements. When John entered the oil business in 1863, kerosene cost roughly 26 cents per gallon. By 1880, it cost less than 9 cents per gallon. Standard Oil had made kerosene affordable for ordinary people, bringing light to millions of homes that could never have afforded whale oil. The company had rationalized a chaotic industry, eliminating waste, improving quality, making the entire system more efficient. These, his defenders said, were real benefits that could not be ignored. His critics had a different view. They saw a man who used his size to bully competitors, who made secret deals with railroads to strangle rivals, who bribed legislators and manipulated markets. They saw a monopolist who, having eliminated competition, could charge whatever he wanted, could dictate terms to producers and consumers alike. They saw, in short, everything that was wrong with unchecked capitalism, the concentration of economic power in the hands of a single individual who answered to no one. Both views contained truth. John D. Rockefeller was a man of contradictions, capable of great vision and great ruthlessness, of generosity and calculation, of building institutions that would benefit millions while destroying the livelihoods of thousands. To understand him fully, we must see him whole, must resist the temptation to make him either hero or villain when he was, like all of us, both. But to see him whole, we must step back from the grand narrative of business empire and look at the man himself in the ordinary moments of his daily life. What was John D. Rockefeller like as a person, not as a captain of industry, but as a human being living day to day? By the late 1870s, when John was in his late 30s and early 40s, he had settled into the routines that would define the rest of his life. He lived in a substantial house in Cleveland, a Victorian mansion on Euclid Avenue, the street that was becoming known as Millionaire's Row. The house was comfortable, but not ostentatious by the standards of the newly rich. There were several bedrooms, a library, a dining room, servants' quarters. It was heated by coal furnaces, lit by gas lamps that would eventually be replaced by electric lights. The furniture was heavy, dark wood, upholstered in sombre fabrics. The walls were covered in patterned wallpaper. Everything was respectable. Nothing was frivolous. John rose early every morning, usually around 6. He would bathe, dress in one of his dark suits, all of them virtually identical, eat a simple breakfast, usually oatmeal or eggs, and then walk to the horse-drawn streetcar that would take him to his office. He was punctual to the minute. His employees could set their watches by his arrival. At the office, located in the Standard Oil building on Euclid Avenue, and later at 26 Broadway in New York, he worked in a large room that was severe in its simplicity. The massive mahogany desk, dark and gleaming, was always meticulously organized. Ledgers were stacked in precise piles, each spine aligned with mathematical precision. Correspondence was sorted into categories, urgent matters in one pile, routine business in another, personal letters in a third. Everything had its place. Nothing was out of order. He read every important letter himself, his bald head bent over the pages, his eyes, lacking even eyebrows or lashes, moving methodically across each line. He dictated responses in a low, even voice to his secretary, never hesitating, never fumbling for words. Each sentence was complete before he spoke it. He reviewed financial reports with the same attention he gave to letters, his finger tracing down columns of numbers, his mind calculating totals and percentages faster than most men could write them down. When he met with partners and managers, he sat at the head of the table in a straight-backed chair, his hands folded in front of him. His manner in these meetings was calm, almost passionless. He rarely raised his voice, even when delivering devastating news like the decision to close a refinery or dismiss a manager. He listened more than he spoke. Men would present proposals, talk for 10 or 15 minutes about opportunities or problems, and John would sit in silence, his face revealing nothing. Then, when they finished, he might ask a single pointed question that revealed he had understood everything, had seen the flaw in their reasoning or the opportunity they had missed. When he did speak, it was in short, precise sentences. He wasted no words. "Do it," he might say, or "No, next item." His colleagues learned to interpret these brevities, to understand that when John said he would think about it, he meant no, and when he said perhaps, he meant he needed more information before deciding. He never explained his decisions unless pressed, and he was almost never pressed because everyone understood that questioning John D. Rockefeller's judgment was unproductive. He had built the largest corporation in America. He knew what he was doing. The atmosphere in his offices was one of hushed efficiency. People spoke in low voices. Footsteps were muffled by carpets. Even the clicking of typewriters seemed subdued, as if the machines themselves understood that excessive noise was not tolerated. Visitors to Standard Oil's headquarters often remarked on how quiet it was, how different from the bustling, boisterous offices of other corporations. This was John's doing. He believed that noise was a symptom of disorder, that a well-run business should operate with the smooth silence of a fine watch. He hated ostentation in business as in life. While other wealthy men rode to work in private carriages, John took the streetcar. While they wore expensive jewellery and carried gold-headed canes, John dressed plainly, wore no jewellery except his wedding ring, carried nothing but a simple pocket watch. He believed that displays of wealth were vulgar and invited envy. Better to appear modest, to blend in, to let others underestimate you. He was meticulous about his health, some would say obsessive. He believed that health was a form of wealth, perhaps the most important form. He ate sparingly, avoiding rich foods and alcohol. He had never smoked, never drank coffee. He chewed his food slowly, believing that proper digestion was essential to vitality. He took regular exercise, walking whenever possible, playing golf in his later years. He went to bed early, usually by 9 or 10, and prized his sleep. And yet, despite all these precautions, in the 1870s, John's health began to fail. The stress of building, Standard Oil, of fighting competitors and critics, of managing the vast and growing enterprise took its toll. He suffered from digestive problems, insomnia, anxiety. He lost weight. His hair, already thinning in his 20s, fell out completely, leaving him bald by his late 30s. He developed alopecia, a condition likely triggered by stress. For the rest of his life, he would be completely hairless, without even eyebrows or eyelashes, a condition that made his appearance distinctive and somewhat unsettling to those who met him. The illness frightened him. It reminded him of mortality, of the fact that all the money in the world could not buy health if the body decided to fail. He consulted doctors, tried various treatments, spent time away from the office recuperating. Slowly he recovered, though he was never again the vigorous young man who had worked 16-hour days without complaint. His personality in these years was difficult to read. Those who worked with him described him as intensely private, almost unknowable. He rarely socialized. He had few friends outside of business associates. His idea of recreation was to sit quietly at home with Seti and the children, perhaps reading the Bible or discussing church affairs. He gave generously to the Erie Street Baptist Church, later called Euclid Avenue Baptist Church, serving on committees, teaching Sunday school, participating in the life of the congregation with the same diligence he brought to business. He was by all accounts a difficult man to like, but an easy man to respect. He kept his word, he paid his debts, he honoured his contracts, but he was cold, calculating, humourless. He rarely laughed. He did not tell jokes or engage in banter. In meetings he would sit silently for long periods, absorbing information, thinking, then deliver a decision in a few words and move on to the next item. His employees found him intimidating. He expected perfection or something close to it, noticed every error, every inefficiency, but he was not a tyrant. He paid well, better than most employers. He promoted based on merit, not favoritism. And he inspired loyalty, partly through fear, but partly through the sense that he was building something important, something that would last. With his children, he was strict but affectionate in his fashion, though his affection manifested in ways that might seem strange to modern sensibilities. He paid them for chores, establishing a complex system of compensation that would have done credit to a small business. 5 cents for killing flies, the going rate based on the difficulty of the task and the value of protecting the household from disease. 10 cents for weeding the garden, because it required sustained effort and contributed to the beauty of the property. A penny for each hour of practice on a musical instrument, because culture mattered even if it could not be directly monetized. He expected them to work for their allowance, not because the family needed the money, obviously, but because he believed that children who did not work would not understand the value of money or develop the character necessary for success. When Bessie, his eldest daughter, asked why she had to give away 10% of her earnings to the church, John sat her down and explained his theology of stewardship. It was not her money, he told her. It was God's money, entrusted to her care. She was merely the steward, the caretaker of resources that ultimately belonged to the divine. The tithe was simply returning to God what already belonged to him. This was not charity, this was justice. This was recognizing the true order of the universe. He kept account books for each child, just as he kept account books for himself and for Standard Oil. Every Saturday evening, there would be a reckoning. The children would present their earnings and their expenditures. John would review their books, checking their arithmetic, asking questions about purchases that seemed frivolous. He praised good decisions, questioned poor ones, but rarely forbade anything outright. He wanted them to learn from their mistakes, to develop judgment through practice. On Sundays, the entire family attended church together, walking to Euclid Avenue Baptist Church in a procession, John and Seti leading, the children following in order of the age. They sat in the same pew every week, in the same order. John sang the hymns in his reedy, unremarkable voice. He listened to the sermons with the same focused attention he brought to business meetings, and afterward he would discuss the sermon with the children over Sunday dinner, asking them what they had learned, what they thought the preacher meant, how they might apply the lessons to their own lives. He was not a playful father. He did not romp with the children or tell them stories or engage in games, but he was present in his way. He took them on carefully planned vacations, trips to the countryside or the mountains where they could learn about nature and appreciate the beauty of God's creation. He taught them to ride bicycles, standing behind them, holding the seat until they found their balance, then letting go and watching as they wobbled but stayed upright, learning that they could do things they had thought impossible. As the children grew older, particularly his son John Jr., he tried to pass on the lessons that had served him. He taught Junior about compound interest, showing him how money invested wisely would grow year after year without further effort. He explained the importance of living below one's means, of saving for the future, of thinking in terms of decades rather than days. He tried to instill in his son the same iron discipline that had carried him from a clerk's stool to the head of Standard Oil. But Junior was not like his father. He was more sensitive, more introspective, more troubled by moral ambiguity. Where John could make hard decisions without apparent anguish, Junior agonized over choices. Where John was comfortable with the ruthlessness business sometimes required, Junior was haunted by the human cost of corporate decisions. This difference would eventually prove beneficial, as Junior would bring a moral dimension to the family's philanthropy that John, for all his Baptist piety, sometimes lacked. Seti was the emotional centre of the family, the source of warmth in a household that could otherwise feel austere. She was the one the children went to with their troubles, their fears, their hopes. She was the one who smoothed over conflicts, who found gentle ways to soften John's rigid standards without contradicting him. She managed the household with the same efficiency John brought to business, but with more grace, more humanity. The servants adored her, the children confided in her, and John, in his way, relied on her completely, even if he could not always express how much she meant to him. This sense of stewardship, the idea that wealth was not truly owned but held in trust, would become increasingly important to John as he aged. As Standard Oil made him wealthier and wealthier, far wealthier than he had ever imagined possible, he began to feel the weight of that wealth. What was it for? What was he supposed to do with it? He could not spend it all, not in 10 lifetimes, and yet it kept accumulating year after year, millions becoming tens of millions becoming hundreds of millions. The question of what to do with wealth would eventually lead him to philanthropy on a scale never before seen. But in the 1870s and 80s, he was still primarily focused on accumulating wealth, on building Standard Oil into an unassailable empire. By 1882, Standard Oil had grown so large and complex that its original corporate structure was inadequate. The company owned refineries in multiple states, pipelines, storage facilities, distribution networks. But laws at the time made it difficult for a corporation chartered in one state to own property in another state. The solution, devised by John's lawyers, was innovative and would have far-reaching consequences. They created the Standard Oil Trust. On January 2nd, 1882, the Standard Oil Trust Agreement was signed. Under this agreement, the stockholders of Standard Oil of Ohio and 40 other related companies transferred their shares to a board of 9 trustees. These trustees, including John Rockefeller, would manage the entire enterprise as a single entity, making decisions for all the companies, directing strategy, allocating resources. In exchange, the stockholders received trust certificates entitling them to a share of the profits. It was a brilliant legal innovation, creating the first great business trust in American history. But it was also deeply troubling to many Americans. The trust concentrated enormous economic power in the hands of a small group of men. It operated across state lines beyond the effective control of any single state government. It seemed to mock the idea of competition, of free markets, of the Jeffersonian ideal of a nation of independent producers and merchants. The public reaction was swift and hostile. Newspapers began to write about the Standard Oil Trust as a monster, an octopus strangling American commerce. Cartoonists drew John Rockefeller as a bloated plutocrat sitting on bags of money while widows and orphans starved. Preachers denounced the trust from their pulpits. Politicians called for investigations, for new laws to curb the power of monopolies. John was baffled by the hostility. He genuinely believed he had done nothing wrong. He had competed fairly, or at least he had competed no more unfairly than anyone else. He had built a great enterprise that served the public by providing cheap, reliable kerosene. He had employed thousands of workers, paid them well, created opportunities for advancement. He had made himself and his partners wealthy, yes, but he had also made America wealthy, had helped build the infrastructure that would turn the nation into an industrial power. Why then was he hated? But hated he was. The 1880s and 90s saw wave after wave of attacks on Standard Oil, and on John personally. Investigations by state legislatures, lawsuits by competitors, editorials denouncing him as the personification of greedy capitalism. And through it all, John remained largely silent. He gave almost no interviews. He made almost no public statements. He believed that explanations were useless, that the public would believe what it wanted to believe, and that the best response was to continue building, continue improving, continue making Standard Oil so efficient and so valuable that its benefits could not be denied. But the attacks took their toll. The stress, combined with the massive responsibilities of managing the sprawling enterprise, brought back his health problems. In the 1880s, he suffered from severe digestive issues, insomnia, anxiety. His weight dropped to barely over 100 pounds. His doctors warned him that if he did not reduce his workload, he might not survive. He was, they said, in danger of working himself to death. So in 1896, at the age of 57, John D. Rockefeller made the difficult decision to retire from the day-to-day management of Standard Oil. He turned over operational control to John Dustin Archbold, a trusted lieutenant who had been with the company for years. John would remain the largest shareholder, would attend board meetings, would have the final say on major decisions, but the grinding daily work of running the empire would fall to others. It was, in a way, the end of one life and the beginning of another. For 40 years, John had devoted himself to business, to accumulation, to building Standard Oil into the largest corporation in America. Now, in the last 40 years of his life, for he would live to be nearly 98, he would devote himself to giving away what he had accumulated. He would become not just a businessman, but a philanthropist, and in that role, he would arguably accomplish even more than he had in business. But philanthropy did not come easily to John. It was not a matter of simply writing checks. He approached giving with the same methodical intensity he had brought to making money. He wanted his gifts to do the most good, to be used efficiently, to create lasting institutions rather than temporary relief. This meant he needed advisors, people who understood education, medicine, science, social reform. He needed a system. The man who helped him create that system was Frederick Taylor Gates, a Baptist minister John had met in 1889. Gates was working for the American Baptist Education Society, trying to raise money for a new university in Chicago. He approached John for a contribution. John, impressed by Gates's vision and intelligence, gave $600,000, the first of many gifts that would eventually total $35 million and would transform a struggling Baptist college into one of the world's great universities, the University of Chicago. But Gates's value to John went far beyond fundraising. Gates had a brilliant, restless mind, always seeking connections, always asking deeper questions. He understood that John's wealth was accumulating faster than it could be sensibly given away using traditional charitable methods. The requests that flooded into John's office every day were overwhelming. Ministers wanted new churches, colleges needed endowments, hospitals sought funding, orphanages required support. Individuals wrote heartbreaking letters about personal tragedies, asking for help. There were thousands of these requests, tens of thousands, and each one represented a real need, a real human suffering. But John could not help everyone, even his vast wealth, as large as it was finite. He needed a way to prioritize, to identify where his money could do the most good. Giving to individual churches, to specific causes, to whoever asked most eloquently or most persistently, this was inefficient and potentially wasteful. It was addressing symptoms rather than causes. It was putting bandages on wounds that needed surgery. What was needed, Gates argued, was a systematic approach, what he called scientific philanthropy. The idea was revolutionary for its time, though it seems obvious now. Instead of giving to soup kitchens to feed the poor, why not fund research into the economic causes of poverty and support programs that would create jobs and opportunities? Instead of supporting hospitals to treat the sick, why not fund medical research to discover the causes of disease and develop cures that would prevent sickness in the first place? Instead of giving money to build schools, why not create institutions that would train teachers, develop new educational methods, research how children learn, and improve the entire system of education from the ground up? This approach appealed powerfully to John's business instincts. It was efficient, getting the maximum return on investment. It was strategic, addressing root causes rather than symptoms. And it promised lasting results rather than temporary relief. A soup kitchen could feed 100 people for a day. A medical research institute could discover a cure that would save millions of lives for generations. The choice seemed obvious. And so, beginning in the 1890s and accelerating after his retirement in 1896, John began to create the great philanthropic institutions that would be his lasting legacy. He approached philanthropy with the same methodical intensity he had brought to business. He consulted experts, read reports, visited institutions, asked penetrating questions. He wanted to understand not just what he was funding, but why, wanted to ensure that every dollar was used wisely, that the institutions he created would be self-sustaining, would continue to do good work long after he was gone. In 1901, he founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, later renamed Rockefeller University. The institute was modelled on the great European research centres like the Pasteur Institute in Paris and the Koch Institute in Berlin, institutions devoted entirely to scientific investigation without the distractions of teaching or patient care. Its mission was simple but profound: to discover the causes and cures of disease through rigorous scientific investigation. The institute started small, with a handful of researchers working in a converted brownstone, but it grew rapidly. John funded the construction of state-of-the-art laboratories, recruited the finest scientific minds in the world, provided generous salaries and research budgets that freed scientists to pursue long-term investigations without worrying about immediate results, and the results, when they came, were spectacular. Researchers at the Rockefeller Institute made fundamental discoveries about the nature of viruses, developed vaccines for yellow fever and other diseases, pioneered techniques in genetics and molecular biology. Over the decades, work done at the Institute would be associated with dozens of Nobel Prizes and would save countless lives. In 1902, he established the General Education Board with an initial gift of $1 million. The board's mission was to promote education, particularly in the American South, which had been devastated by the Civil War and Reconstruction. The board funded the building of schools, the training of teachers, the improvement of curricula. It paid particular attention to the education of African Americans. supporting historically black colleges and universities at a time when such institutions received almost no support from state or federal governments. In 1909, he created the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission for the eradication of hookworm disease. Hookworm was a parasitic infection endemic in the rural South, affecting millions of people, sapping their energy, stunting children's growth, perpetuating poverty. The Commission mounted a massive public health campaign, treating infected individuals, improving sanitation, educating the public about hygiene. Within a few years, hookworm was largely eradicated in the United States, a stunning public health success. And in 1913, John created his greatest philanthropic achievement, the Rockefeller Foundation. Chartered with the mission to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world, the foundation would fund everything from medical research to agricultural improvement to the arts. It would work in more than 50 countries, combat diseases, improve food production, advance science, support education. By the time of John's death, the foundation had an endowment of hundreds of millions of dollars and was one of the most influential philanthropic organizations in the world. These institutions were not created on a whim. John labored over them, worried about them, insisted they be structured to last. He wanted to ensure that his wealth would continue to do good long after he was gone, that it would not be dissipated through poor management or captured by special interests. So he insisted on professional management, on boards of trustees that included the best minds in their fields, on rigorous standards of accountability. He applied the same principles to philanthropy that he had applied to business: efficiency, accountability, long-term thinking. By the early 1900s, John D. Rockefeller was undergoing a transformation in the public mind. The man who had been reviled as a robber baron in the 1890s was now being seen, at least by some, as a great benefactor. His gifts to education and medicine were too substantial to ignore. Newspapers that had once excoriated him now praised his generosity. Ministers who had denounced him from the pulpit now thanked God for his philanthropy. But the transformation was not complete and not universal. Many still saw his philanthropy as an attempt to buy redemption, to cleanse a fortune made through ruthless and possibly illegal business practices. And in the first decade of the 20th century, those business practices came under renewed scrutiny, this time from the federal government. The catalyst was a journalist named Ida Minerva Tarbell, a woman whose personal history made her the perfect nemesis for John D. Rockefeller. Ida had grown up in the oil regions of Pennsylvania, in the town of Titusville where the first commercial oil well had been drilled. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, had been an independent oil producer and refiner, one of the small businessmen who had tried to compete with Standard Oil in the 1870s and 80s. She had watched her father's business slowly strangled by Standard Oil's tactics, the preferential railroad rates that made it impossible for independents to compete, the predatory pricing that drove down profits, the relentless pressure to sell out or be destroyed. She had seen her father's spirit broken, had watched him age prematurely under the strain, had felt the financial insecurity that came when the family business failed. She had never forgotten, and when, in 1902, the editor of McClure's magazine asked her to investigate Standard Oil, she took on the assignment with the zeal of someone seeking not just truth, but justice, perhaps even revenge. For 2 years, Ida Tarbell immersed herself in the history of Standard Oil. She interviewed hundreds of people, former Standard Oil employees who had left in disgust, competitors who had been driven out of business, railroad officials who had negotiated the secret rebate agreements. She pored over court records, legislative, testimony, corporate documents. She travelled to Cleveland, to New York, to the oil regions of Pennsylvania, following the trail of Standard Oil's rise to dominance. What she discovered was damning. She found evidence of systematic efforts to eliminate competition through means that, while perhaps not strictly illegal at the time, certainly violated any reasonable standard of fair dealing. She found secret agreements with railroads that gave Standard Oil not just rebates on its own shipments, but also payments called drawbacks, based on the volume of oil its competitors shipped. In other words, every time a competitor shipped oil, Standard Oil received money from the railroad. It was a scheme so audacious, so brazen in its unfairness, that when Tarbell revealed it, even Standard Oil's defenders were hard-pressed to justify it. She documented how Standard Oil had used industrial espionage, placing agents in competitors' operations to learn their business strategies, their customer lists, their cost structures. She showed how the company had used its size to pressure suppliers, threatening to take their business elsewhere if they continued to sell to Standard Oil's competitors. She detailed the Cleveland Massacre and dozens of similar episodes in other cities, showing a pattern of predation that belied Rockefeller's claim that Standard Oil had simply been more efficient than its rivals. But perhaps most devastating was her portrait of Rockefeller himself. She had met him once briefly, and had been struck by his coldness, his apparent lack of human warmth. In her articles, she painted him as a man devoid of normal emotions, a calculating machine in human form, someone who could ruin competitors without remorse, who saw business purely as war and acted accordingly. She called him the embodiment of corporate greed, the symbol of everything that was wrong with American capitalism in the Gilded Age. The series ran for 19 months, from November 1902 to October 1904, each installment more damning than the last. It was muckraking journalism of the highest order, thoroughly researched, compellingly written, devastating in its implications. The public, already suspicious of Standard Oil, now had chapter and verse on exactly how the monopoly had been built. The series caused a sensation. Circulation of McClure's magazines soared. Other magazines rushed to publish exposés of other trusts. Politicians seized on the revelations to call for stricter antitrust enforcement. The progressive movement, which had been gaining strength, now had a perfect target and a perfect symbol. John was deeply hurt by Tarbell's articles, more hurt than he would admit publicly. He had always believed that he had conducted himself honourably, or at least as honourably as the rough-and-tumble world of business allowed. He had competed aggressively, yes, but he had broken no laws. He had crushed competitors, true, but only those who refused his generous offers to buy them out. He had built Standard Oil through superior efficiency and organisation, not through unfair practices. At least, that was how he saw it. But what truly wounded him was Tarbell's exposure of his father's double life. In her research, she had uncovered the truth about William Avery, Devil Bill Rockefeller, his bigamy, his life under the assumed name William Livingston, his schemes and scams. This was the shame John had spent decades trying to hide, the secret that embarrassed him more than any business controversy. His father had died in 1906, and John had never publicly acknowledged the truth of his father's life. Now Tarbell had exposed it for all the world to see, had made the connection between the son's business practices and the father's moral failures. John rarely spoke of Tarbell publicly, but those close to him knew the articles had wounded him deeply. He became even more withdrawn, more reluctant to speak to the press. When he was asked about her accusations, he would say simply that she did not understand business, that competition in the oil industry had been necessary to bring order to chaos, that Standard Oil had benefited consumers by lowering prices and improving quality. He would not engage with her specific charges, would not defend his methods in detail. This silence was interpreted by many as an admission of guilt, though it was more likely simply John's lifelong reluctance to explain himself to people he believed would not or could not understand. But worse than the personal embarrassment was the legal consequence. Tarbell's series strengthened the hand of those calling for antitrust action against Standard Oil. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt's administration filed suit under the Sherman Antitrust Act, charging that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly that restrained trade. The case dragged on for years, through depositions and hearings and appeals. John was called to testify. He answered questions in his characteristic manner, briefly, precisely, admitting nothing, explaining that Standard Oil had simply been more efficient than its competitors. But the evidence was overwhelming. Internal documents showed the secret rebate agreements, the deliberate strategies to drive competitors out of business, the manipulation of prices to control markets. On May 15, 1911, the United States Supreme Court delivered its verdict. Standard Oil was an unreasonable monopoly in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The court ordered the company dissolved, broken into 39 separate entities. The great empire John had spent 40 years building was to be torn apart. The decision detailed the court's reasoning in language that was damning. The justices found that Standard Oil had achieved its dominance through methods that went beyond normal competition, had engaged in practices designed to eliminate competitors rather than simply to outcompete them. The secret rebates, the predatory pricing, the industrial espionage, the coercive acquisitions, all of these were documented and condemned. The court stopped short of declaring John a criminal, but it left little doubt that the methods he had used were, in the justice's view, destructive to the public interest. It should have been a catastrophe for John personally. It should have destroyed his fortune, scattered his life's work to the winds. But in one of history's great ironies, perhaps the greatest irony of a life full of them, the breakup of Standard Oil made John Rockefeller even richer than before. Here is how it happened. When the court ordered Standard Oil broken into 39 companies, John owned about 25% of the original company's stock. That stock was divided among all 39 successor companies in proportion to his original holdings. So instead of owning a quarter of one company, he now owned a quarter of 39 companies. And these companies, freed from the stigma of the monopoly, free to operate independently, free to compete in their own markets, thrived beyond anyone's expectations. The company that had been Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. The company that had been Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. And a dozen other companies, many of which remain among the largest corporations in the world, all traced their lineage directly back to the original Standard Oil. And John owned significant shares in all of them. In the years following the breakup, as the global demand for oil exploded with the rise of the automobile, as the internal combustion engine replaced the steam engine, as oil became not just a source of light but a source of power and mobility, the value of these companies soared. Stock prices doubled, then tripled, then quadrupled. Dividends rolled in month after month. By 1913, just 2 years after the breakup, John's wealth was estimated at close to $1 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum at a time when the average American worker made perhaps $500 a year. John watched this happen with a kind of bemused detachment. He had not wanted Standard Oil broken up, had believed sincerely that the company was providing a valuable service, that consolidation was efficient and beneficial. But now that it had been broken up, now that the deed was done, he could see the logic of it. The successor companies were vigorous, competitive, innovative. Perhaps, he thought, the court had been right. Perhaps the time for Standard Oil as a unified entity had passed. Perhaps the industry needed competition to drive further progress. But he said none of this publicly. He maintained his silence, as he almost always did when controversies swirled around him. He let others interpret the breakup as they would. And what most people saw was that John D. Rockefeller, the man, They had reviled as a robber baron. The man whose company had been declared an illegal monopoly had emerged from the antitrust case wealthier than ever. It was, many said, proof that the rich were above the law, that no matter what society did to curb their power, they found ways to profit. And yet, by this time, wealth meant almost nothing to him. He had long since retired from business. His health was fragile. His wife Seti had died in 1915, a loss that devastated him despite his stoic exterior. He was in his 70s, bald, frail, weighing barely 100 pounds, living quietly at his various estates. He had 3 primary residences by the 19-teens and 20s. In the summer, he stayed at Pocantico Hills, a vast estate north of New York City, where he had bought up entire villages to create a private domain of rolling hills and carefully maintained forests. In the spring and fall, he lived at his home in Lakewood, New Jersey, a modest house by the standards of the very rich. And in the winter, he lived at a mansion called the Casements in Ormond Beach, Florida, a place of sunshine and warmth where he could play golf and escape the northern cold. The daily routine of his later years was simple and unchanging, a pattern repeated with comforting regularity. He rose early, usually before dawn, the habit of a lifetime too ingrained to break even in old age. In the winter months at the Casements in Florida, he would wake to darkness, then watch through his window as the eastern sky slowly brightened. First grey, then pink, then gold as the sun climbed out of the Atlantic. This was his favourite time of day, these quiet moments before the household stirred, when he could sit in his chair and think about the long journey that had brought him from a farmhouse in Richford to this mansion overlooking the sea. He ate a light breakfast, his appetite diminished by age. Perhaps oatmeal with a touch of milk, a piece of toast with no butter, a cup of warm water. His doctor had forbidden coffee years ago, and he had never touched alcohol, so water was his only beverage. He chewed slowly, deliberately, believing that proper digestion began in the mouth. He had read somewhere that each bite should be chewed 32 times, once for each tooth, and though he had no teeth left, only dentures, he maintained the practice. After breakfast, he read the Bible, the same passages he had read for decades, verses from Proverbs about wisdom and wealth, from the Gospels about faith and duty. The Bible he used was old, its leather cover worn soft from handling, its pages thin and fragile. His children had offered to buy him a new one, a fine edition with gilt edges and illustrations, but he refused. This Bible had been his companion for 50 years. He knew its weight in his hands, knew the feel of each page. A new Bible, however beautiful, would be a stranger. Then he would go for a drive in one of his automobiles, though he never learned to. Drive himself! The automobile had always been someone else's domain, a technology he appreciated but did not master. He would sit in the back seat while a chauffeur drove him through the countryside or along the beach, and he would watch the world pass by the window. In Florida, this meant palm trees swaying in the ocean breeze, Spanish moss hanging from live oaks, glimpses of the Atlantic stretching to the horizon. Sometimes they would drive into Daytona Beach, and he would see ordinary people going about their lives, working, shopping, hurrying from place to place, and he would remember being one of them, would remember rushing to work as a young clerk, would remember the anxiety of not knowing where next month's rent would come from. It was during these drives that he practiced his ritual of giving away dimes to children he encountered. He always carried a pocket full of shiny new dimes, coins he had ordered specially from the bank. When he saw a child, he would have the car stopped, would roll down the window, would hold out the coin. "Young man," he would say, or "young lady," and the child would approach shyly, perhaps in awe of the strange-looking old man with no hair at all, not even eyebrows. "Here is a dime," he would tell them. 10 dimes make $1. If you save your dimes, you can become wealthy. Some people found this practice charming, a harmless eccentricity of a kind old man. Others found it condescending, even insulting. Here was the richest man in the world, a man who could have given away hundreds of dollars to each child without noticing the cost, and he gave them 10 cents and told them to save. But John did not see it that way. To him, the dime was not the gift. The lesson was the gift. Money itself meant nothing. Understanding money, respecting it, using it wisely, that was everything. A child who learned to save dimes would grow into an adult who could manage wealth. A child who simply received money without earning it would never learn its value. In the afternoons, if he felt strong enough, he might play golf, a game he had taken up in his 60s, and which he played with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else. He was not a good golfer, but he was a determined one. He kept score meticulously, recording every stroke in a little notebook, analysing his mistakes, working to improve. He took lessons from professionals, practiced his swing, read books about golf technique. At 90, he was still trying to break 100, still believing that improvement was possible through effort and study. Or he might work in his gardens, which were extensive and carefully maintained by a staff of gardeners who understood that Mr. Rockefeller had strong opinions about how flowers should be arranged and lawns should be cut. He loved flowers, particularly roses, and would spend hours walking among the beds, examining blooms, discussing varieties with the head gardener, making suggestions about where new plantings might go. There was something about gardens that appealed to him, their order and beauty, the way careful tending produced predictable results, the sense that even nature could be improved through patient effort. Evenings were quiet, the rhythm slowing as the day wound down. Dinner was simple, plain food simply prepared, chicken or fish, vegetables, bread, fruit, nothing spiced or rich, nothing that might disturb his delicate digestion. He ate in the dining room with whatever family members were visiting, though often he ate alone, attended by servants but essentially solitary. After dinner, he might read or listen to music on the phonograph. He had developed a late appreciation for classical music, though he could not have explained why one piece moved him and another left him cold. Sometimes he simply sat in silence, his hands folded in his lap, his mind wandering through memories, decades of memories, more memories than any one person should have to carry. He went to bed early, usually by 9. He slept in a large bed in a room that was kept cool, almost cold, because he had read that cool air promoted health. He wore simple cotton nightclothes. The room was dark, the curtains drawn against whatever light might leak in from outside. And there, in the darkness, John D. Rockefeller would slip into sleep, his breathing slow and even, his ancient body at rest after another day of a life that seemed to go on and on. Because John D. Rockefeller wanted very much to live to be 100 years old. It became an obsession in his later years, this goal of reaching the century mark. He believed that with proper care, with attention to diet and exercise and rest, he could achieve it. He tracked his health carefully, consulted doctors regularly, followed their advice religiously. He was determined to prove that longevity, like wealth, could be achieved through discipline and planning. As he aged into his 80s and then his 90s, he became a kind of living monument. People came to see him, not for business, but out of curiosity, to meet the man who had built Standard Oil, who had given away more money than anyone in history, who had lived through the transformation of America from farm to factory. He received them graciously, spoke briefly, offered his usual advice about thrift and hard work and faith in God. But the visits tired him. By his mid-90s he was fragile, his skin paper-thin, his body wasted to barely 90 pounds. his face a network of wrinkles, and yet his mind remained sharp. He could still discuss business, could still remember the details of transactions from 50 years earlier, could still calculate compound interest in his head. He read the newspapers every day, followed the stock market, kept track of his investments. He had not made his fortune by luck, and he did not intend to lose it through inattention. In the 1930s, as John approached his 100th birthday, the world was in turmoil. The Great Depression had devastated the economy. Unemployment was rampant. Banks were failing. Businesses were closing. The very foundations of American capitalism seemed to be crumbling. And yet, the Rockefeller fortune, carefully managed, carefully diversified, survived and even grew. John gave more during the Depression, helping to fund relief efforts, supporting institutions that were struggling. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had taken over management of the family's philanthropic work and was continuing it on an even grander scale. Junior, as he was called, had none of his father's business instincts but all of his philanthropic vision. He funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, donated the land for the United Nations headquarters in New York, built Rockefeller Center in Manhattan. The family that had been reviled in the 1890s was now seen as one of America's great philanthropic dynasties, but John Sr. in his 90s was increasingly removed from all of this. He lived quietly at his estates, attended by servants and nurses, visited occasionally by family. His daughters, Bessie and Edith, had predeceased him. His daughter Alta lived in Massachusetts and visited when she could. His son Junior came regularly, bringing the grandchildren, trying to bridge the gap between the vigorous young people and the ancient man who could barely remember being young himself. John's last years were peaceful, in a way his middle years had never been. There were no more battles to fight, no more competitors to vanquish, no more critics to answer. The Supreme Court had dissolved Standard Oil, but the successor companies thrived. The muckrakers had exposed his methods, but the philanthropy had redeemed his reputation. He had lived long enough to see the pendulum swing from hatred to admiration, long enough to become a kind of benign grandfather figure, the last titan of the industrial age. In the spring of 1937, John was living at the Casements in Ormond Beach. He was 97 years old, less than 2 months from his 98th birthday. He had not quite reached his goal of living to 100, but he'd come close, closer than most. His health, which had been remarkably good through the winter, began to decline in May. He felt tired, more tired than usual. His appetite diminished. He spent more time in bed. On Thursday, May 20th, he complained of feeling unwell. His physician, Dr. Harry L. Merriday, examined him and found his condition stable. There was, the doctor assured John's family, nothing to cause immediate concern. But on Friday and Saturday, John had several sinking spells, moments when his vitality seemed to ebb, when he seemed to be slipping away. Each time he rallied, but weakly, like a man mustering his reserves for one last effort. On Saturday night, May 22nd, John sank into a coma. He lay in his air-conditioned bedroom, attended by his cousin Fanny Evans, who served as his housekeeper, his longtime valet John H. Yordy, and his night nurse Roy C. Sly. None of his children were with him. John Jr. was at Pocantico Hills, nearly 1,500 miles away. Alta was at her home in Massachusetts. They had been told there was no immediate danger, no need to rush to Florida. Around midnight, as Saturday became Sunday, John stirred briefly. His lips moved. The nurse leaned close. "Raise me up a little bit," John whispered. They adjusted his pillows, lifting him slightly in the bed. He settled back. His breathing became slower, more laboured. The room was silent except for the ticking of a clock and the soft sound of breath moving in and out of wasted lungs. At 4:05 on the morning of Sunday, May 23, 1937, John Davison Rockefeller died. He was 97 years and 318 days old. The cause of death was sclerotic myocarditis, a hardening of the heart muscles that had slowly constricted the organ's ability to pump blood. But in a larger sense, he had simply worn out. He had lived longer than almost anyone of his generation, had seen and done more than seemed possible for one lifetime. Now, in the quiet pre-dawn hours of a Sunday morning, with the Atlantic Ocean whispering outside his window, he let go. Dr. Merriday, called to the bedside, pronounced him dead. His passing was peaceful, the doctor told reporters later. He had no final message. Apparently he didn't realise he was dying. As word spread through Ormond Beach, people gathered at the gates of the casements, standing in respectful silence. At the Union Baptist Church where Rockefeller had sometimes worshipped, the sexton, a man named James Davis, to whom Rockefeller had given many dimes over the years, tolled the bell. He was a fine, gentle soul and a real Christian, Davis said. Similar scenes played out in Lakewood, New Jersey, and at Pocantico Hills, New York, as news of the death spread. The body was transported by private railroad car from Florida to New York. The same journey Rockefeller had made dozens of times in life, now made one final time in death. At Pocantico Hills, a private funeral service was held in the same room where Setti's funeral had been conducted 22 years earlier. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, pastor of Riverside Church, which Rockefeller had helped fund, officiated. The service was simple as Rockefeller would have wanted. Hymns were sung, scriptures were read, a brief eulogy was delivered. The family and close associates paid their respects. Then the body was taken to Cleveland for burial. Cleveland, where he had arrived as a boy of 14, where he had started his first job, where he had built his first refinery, where he had launched Standard Oil. Cleveland was home in a way that New York or Florida could never be. And so it was in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland that John D. Rockefeller was laid to rest beside his wife Setty in a plot marked by a tall obelisk, a monument to a life that had been monumental. The funeral in Cleveland was public and thousands attended. Flags flew at half-staff. Businesses closed. People lined the streets as the cortege passed. Ordinary people who had never met Rockefeller but who had read about him, who had worked in industries he had shaped, who had benefited from institutions he had funded. The hatred of earlier decades had faded. What remained was a kind of awe at the scale of what he had accomplished for good and for ill. What then is the legacy of John D. Rockefeller? How do we nearly a century after his death understand a man so complex, so contradictory, so influential? On the purely material level, his legacy is everywhere we look. The companies created from the breakup of Standard Oil include ExxonMobil, Chevron, and other giants of the oil industry. These companies, among the largest corporations in the world by revenue, trace their lineage directly back to the enterprise he created. The modern oil and gas industry, with all its global reach and economic power, with its networks of pipelines and refineries and distribution systems, with its influence on geopolitics and its impact on climate, is built on foundations he laid. When we fill our gas tanks, when we turn on our heat in winter, when we buy products made from petroleum derivatives, we are participating in systems he helped create. But the legacy goes far deeper than oil companies. Rockefeller essentially invented the modern corporation as we know it, the large-scale, vertically integrated enterprise that dominates contemporary capitalism. Before Standard Oil, most businesses were small, local, family-owned. A grocer owned one store. A manufacturer operated one factory. A farmer worked his own land. There were partnerships, yes, and small corporations, but nothing on the scale of Standard Oil, nothing that approached the systematic consolidation of an entire industry under centralized management. Rockefeller showed that by consolidating operations, by controlling every aspect of production and distribution, by operating on a massive scale, a company could achieve efficiencies impossible for smaller competitors. He demonstrated that economies of scale were real, that bigger was often cheaper and more efficient. This was not an abstract economic theory. It was concrete reality, proven by Standard Oil's ability to refine oil more cheaply, to deliver products more reliably, to lower prices for consumers while making vast profits for shareholders. This model would be copied by Andrew Carnegie in steel, creating US Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation. It would be copied by JP Morgan in banking, consolidating dozens of smaller banks into financial empires. It would be copied by Henry Ford in automobiles, creating the assembly line and mass production. It would be copied in meatpacking, in tobacco, in sugar, in every major industry in America and eventually in the world. The corporation as we know it today, with its hierarchies of management, its functional specialization, its relentless focus on efficiency and growth, its ability to operate across state lines and national borders, is largely Rockefeller's creation, for better and for worse. He also helped create paradoxically the regulatory state that governs corporations. The public backlash against Standard Oil's monopoly led directly to the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the entire framework of antitrust law that followed. The Clayton Act, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the regulations that govern how corporations merge and compete, how they report their finances, how they treat their workers, all of these trace their origins to the problems Rockefeller's success created. The progressives who fought Standard Oil in the courts and in the legislatures were not anti-business. They were trying to save capitalism from itself, trying to create rules that would preserve competition and prevent any one entity from gaining the kind of dominance Standard Oil had achieved. In this sense, John D. Rockefeller was the father of both modern corporate capitalism and modern corporate regulation. He showed what was possible when business was unrestrained, and in showing that, he made restraint inevitable. His very success made his methods impossible for anyone else to replicate, because society, seeing what he had done, changed the rules. In trying to build an unassailable business empire, he inadvertently created the legal and regulatory apparatus that would prevent anyone from ever doing it again. It is hard to think of a more profound irony. In Philanthropy, his influence is equally profound, and perhaps more beneficial. Before Rockefeller, the very rich gave to charity, but they did so haphazardly, responding to individual appeals, funding projects they personally liked, operating on instinct rather than strategy. A wealthy man might endow a hospital because his wife had been treated there, or fund a church because he attended it, or support a college because he had graduated from it. These were personal gestures, acts of individual generosity, but they were not systematic. They did not address root causes. They did not create institutions designed to persist and grow. Rockefeller, with Frederick Taylor Gates's help, created scientific philanthropy, the idea that charitable giving should be systematic, should address root causes rather than symptoms, should create institutions that would persist and compound their benefits over time. Just as money invested wisely will compound through interest, so too can philanthropy compound its impact if structured correctly. A hospital treats the sick today. A medical research institute discovers cures that prevent sickness tomorrow and for all the tomorrows after that. The Rockefeller Foundation became the model for every major foundation that followed. The Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Every one of these organizations is built on the template Rockefeller established: professional staff, expert governance, focus on systemic solutions, long-term thinking, rigorous evaluation of results. The entire non-profit sector as we know it today, the foundations and think tanks and research institutes, owes much to the example Rockefeller set. The specific institutions he funded continue to do extraordinary work. Rockefeller University has been affiliated with 38 Nobel Prize winners and continues to be one of the world's leading biomedical research institutions. The University of Chicago is one of the great universities of the world, with 95 Nobel laureates among its faculty and alumni. The Rockefeller Foundation has worked in more than 100 countries, funding everything from the Green Revolution that prevented mass starvation in Asia to the development of yellow fever and malaria vaccines to the preservation of cultural heritage sites. And beyond these tangible institutions, there is the example of his life, an example that is both inspiring and cautionary. Inspiring because he proved that in America, a boy with nothing could rise to extraordinary heights through discipline, hard work, and intelligent planning. Cautionary because he showed that success achieved through ruthless means, even legal means, can exact a terrible price in reputation and in human relationships. Rockefeller was not a warm man. He had few friends. He was distant from his children in ways he probably regretted but could not change. He inspired fear more than love. He sacrificed much of his health and his happiness in the pursuit of wealth and power. And yet he also showed that wealth, once accumulated, could be transformed into something genuinely beneficial, could build institutions that would educate and heal and enlighten long after the man himself was gone. Perhaps the final judgment on John D. Rockefeller is that he was a man of his time, shaped by the brutal economic competition of the Gilded Age, by the absence of effective regulation, by the social Darwinist belief that the strong deserve to survive and the weak deserve to fail. He was not more ruthless than the age demanded, but neither was he more merciful. He played the game as it existed, played it better than anyone else, and won completely. Then, having won, he tried to redeem himself through giving away what he had taken. Whether that redemption was genuine or merely pragmatic, whether his philanthropy was an act of conscience or of image management, these are questions each person must answer for themselves. What cannot be disputed is the scale of his impact. For better and worse, for richer and poorer, John D. Rockefeller shaped the America we inherited, shaped the capitalism we practice, shaped the way the very wealthy think about their obligations to society. On that Sunday morning in May when he died, the sun rose over the Atlantic as it always had, indifferent to human achievement or human loss. The waves continued their eternal rhythm. Children would wake and play. Adults would work and worry. The world would go on. But it would go on in a world John D. Rockefeller had fundamentally altered. A world of great corporations and great foundations. Of oil that powered automobiles and electricity. Of universities that pushed the boundaries of knowledge. Of medicines that cured diseases that had once been death sentences. He had wanted to live to 100. He fell short by less than 3 years. But in the 97 years he did live, he packed more ambition, more achievement, more controversy, and more influence than a dozen ordinary lifetimes. He was the son of a con man who became the richest man in the world. He was the ruthless monopolist who became the greatest philanthropist in history. He was the most hated man in America who became a beloved grandfather figure. He was in every sense an American original, impossible to categorize, impossible to forget. And now, nearly a century after his death, we are still trying to understand him, still debating whether he was hero or villain, still living in the world he helped create. The shiny dimes he gave to children are long since spent. The oil wells he never drilled but profited from are slowly running dry. But the institutions he built, the foundations he established, the example he set, both good and bad, these persist. This is his legacy. This is what remains. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of John D. Rockefeller. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes this work possible. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Rockefeller's life? Hero or villain or something more complex? Until our next journey into history, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Good night